All right, why don't we start?
Get started.
Yeah, great. It's okay. It's okay. Thanks for coming. So I'm excited to be here. This book came out in May, and one of the main reasons I wrote it was that I wanted to come out and have conversations with people about not just the particular story that I was writing about, which is my involvement with this little food co-op in Orange, Mass. Anybody familiar with Orange at all? So like it's a little mill town, it's rural-ish, and it's kind of in that we think of a little sort of a hinterland north of the Quabbin Reservoir there. So that's a specific story, but I also teach about food systems and kind of food issues at Tufts. I'm an anthropologist and I teach in environmental studies about food. And I usually have like 15 weeks of a class to kind of get into the big issues in the food system. But even with 15 weeks, it's a lot. And it takes time to sort of think about how we relate to this often really kind of crazy food system that we're embedded in. There's a lot that's mysterious about it and gets more mysterious the more you think about it. So the local story that I was telling was a way to sort of expand into explaining this bigger story of how we got the food system that we have, which a lot of us have a sense that there's things in it that we ought to be working to try to change. So let me just very quickly start with just that term food system that I'm using, which I always think is familiar to everybody until I teach a class and some student says, what is a food system anyway? What is the food system? So basically it's just a way of thinking about all the stuff that goes into getting the food, our food to us, and most of us are not doing, we're not responsible for our own self-sufficiency at this point, right? We're getting food from somewhere else. So what is that somewhere else where we're getting it? And there's lots of different ways to kind of envision this. So this is a nice sort of simple circular one that you can sort of envision the food going from the farm to the processor to the store to the table and to the compost and then back to the farm. You can also start thinking about all the things that food connects to, which is like everything when you get thinking about it. So that's my favorite food system map. You try to think about energy and technology and politics and environment and climate and all of those things. So when you do start thinking about it, and I find my students often struggle with this, it can become sort of overwhelming. It feels like food is a place we should be able to make change and do things, but then when we realize how big this all is, it's like where do we even start? And yet food is this great place to start, right? Because we all eat every day. Most of us are shoppers. Many of us grow at least some of our own food. So that's just kind of a way of thinking about the task that I was after with this book, which is to try to tell a story that would be engaging. It would bring people into more of the complexities, but also in a way that wasn't just overwhelming, that sort of felt like you could actually do something. So just to kind of poll people here to start, when you think about the food system that feeds most of us, which involves grocery stores, usually supermarkets and wholesalers and things like that, what are sort of its big pros and cons? What is it? Do you think what's working well and what do you think is not working well?
The variety is astonishing.
Astonishing is a great word for it. Yeah.
And the extended seasons.
Yeah, good. Yep, so that we can get almost anything we want almost all year round, usually all year round from like all over the world. It is astonishing. It is a truly like almost miraculous way of getting food, unprecedented in human history. This last basically 100 and some years, there's not been anything like that. So yeah, that's a pro. What are some other pros or cons?
I don't understand most of the ingredients.
Yeah.
They use words that I've never heard of.
Yeah. What is this even?
I don't even know what I mean.
Yeah, so that speaks to a whole lot of things, kind of the other side of that abundance, which is the complexity and the industrialization and the how sophisticated the food science has become, usually to make a saleable product that's profitable. We'll talk a little bit about that a little later on, but yeah, but then the downside of that is like this sense of distance, and we don't know what's going on, and we don't see it being made. We don't know who's making it. That's usually seen as a con. Right? Yeah. Any others? Yeah.
I think the initiative to go local.
Yeah.
Is a positive.
Good. Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah.
A little bit more control, knowing where the food is coming
Good.
from and
Yeah.
how it's been processed or not processed.
Yeah.
And also on the environmental footprint.
Good.
Having it lighten up.
Yeah. Good. So that's definitely a you know, a detriment that a lot of how food is produced industrially is very damaging ecologically. It's often very bad for workers, sometimes for the other species in it. But then the other side of your, you know, like not knowing what's in it is people wanting to gain more control and more sense of connection, right? So that's where I think most people tend to go, and it's certainly where I went when I started thinking about food issues, is like I'm just going to get a closer touch with my food supply and, you know, grow some of my own food and get to know farmers and go to farmers markets and get involved with the co-op, which was good. And I think that's, as I say, it's the place where a lot of us go. And then I wrote this in the book. And then I sort of accidentally became a grocer and everything changed. And that's what I wrote the book about. And so I'm going to talk about kind of what changed for me when I actually got into the food business. So I think, you know, all of us know about food because we're all eaters, but the food business and kind of the food economy is something that most of us don't need to know about. Has anybody here like been involved in like a food business, trying to make any money selling food? It's really, really hard. It's really hard to do at a small scale. It's even hard to do at a large scale, but in some ways you can only do it at a very large scale. So that, to me, was important to know because it told me why, like a lot of us want to make change, but it's very hard to do because of this sort of economic context for it. So, and I say sort of accidentally because I didn't actually intend to do this or to learn as much as I did about the economics, kind of the economic guts of the system. So I was, in late 2016, this was after the US election, and things had just been very fraught and polarized, and you know, people were sort of feeling like on the national scale, stuff's going a little crazy. And I wanted to do something local that I felt would be productive and, you know, strong in my own community. So there was a little food co-op that had started in 2009. It had moved into a storefront in 2014, so 2 years earlier, and was on the point of bankruptcy. So it was like already failing. They had sort of launched a little too quickly, a little too ambitious, and then found that they were not able to sustain it. So I thought, well, I can go and help. I'm an educator. I had worked in nonprofits. I know how to build a board of directors. I can do communications, all of that stuff. I had no intention of getting involved in, you know, like the cash register stuff or the financials. You know, somebody else was going to do all of that. And what I found was that we were so stretched for resources and people, and a lot of people were sort of stepping away at that point, that I got really pulled into a whole lot of things that I did not intend to do, and learned so much. I say this is my postgraduate education because I have learned a lot of things, some of which I didn't really want to, but I felt, this is where I kind of feel like I've come out of it like, okay, I know something about the food business now that I didn't know, that has really helped me to think about this, like what would it take to actually make deeper change here. So I found that one of the things that really struck me was that we have been actually operating under profitability in this little store for 10 years, except for 2 months. There was 2 months when we were above profitability. Does anybody want to guess what those 2 months might have been?
November and December?
No, it's actually 2 very specific months in 1 year. Yeah, it's not. I wish it was 2 months out of every year, but it was like 2 months out of 10 years.
Did they clear your shelves off during COVID because nobody else had supply?
Yes, and not quite that they cleared it off, but that they were flocking to our little store during COVID, and we had been sort of begging people to come and shop before that. But during COVID, partly because the supermarkets had that scare where, you know, they suddenly looked not as reliable, but they also seemed, they were bigger, the footprint was bigger, and people were trying to support little local ventures, and they wanted the lovely fresh greens that were coming in from our local farmers and all of that stuff. We had 2 wonderful months. It was April and May of 2020 that we actually were making money. It was great. Other than that, we have lost money every single month. And we're still there because we're very determined, and we do a lot of fundraising, actually. But this was really eye-opening for me to realize how taken for granted I just assumed, like this way of shopping and eating and living, which I realized was like a very middle-class way of living. It was a very white middle-class way of living. And to be involved in a project that it's like it's almost impossible for us to succeed because we're small scale, we're in a low density area, we're selling high quality food from people that we're trying to pay fairly. You know, it's like we cannot compete with Walmart, which is a mile down the road. We have a Walmart, we have a Hannaford, we have a Market Basket, so we can't compete with them, right? So it was really eye-opening to be sort of put into that position that I never felt myself in as a well-educated white middle-class person of just like, you can't succeed here. And yet it's like, well, we're going to find a way to succeed anyway, right? So there was some really sort of class and race awakenings for me in thinking about how our food system is built for a certain kind of consumer. And I had been that happy, targeted consumer until I kind of stepped over the line to being the person trying to make some kind of an alternative, or to help make an alternative. So that's one of the meanings of margins in the title. Food margins is to, that this business is on the margins of the dominant system, of the mainstream system. It is outside, it makes no economic sense to try to sell food like this. It really doesn't. It makes moral sense, it makes ecological sense, it makes social sense. It's a great project, but if you were trying to make money, this is not how you would go about doing it. So that's one of the meanings of margins. And the other one is that it's literally about profit margins. And so I talk about this as kind of getting into the economic guts of how the food system works, because it's driven by market considerations. That's the system that we have. It's a market-based system, for better and worse. And it is not impossible to have like a market-based system that also feeds people well and certainly feeds them abundantly, right? But beyond a certain scale, and we've been well beyond this scale for more than 100 years now, the profit decision, or the decision-making tends to be driven by the profit considerations rather than the moral or ecological or social. And it's a very, very brutally competitive business. For one reason for that is that there's very little profit margin in food. And I think most people don't recognize this either. So it's really normal for a big supermarket chain, like a really successful big supermarket chain, like Kroger, to make somewhere between 1% and 3% annual net profit, which is crazy, right? It's crazy. So the reason that they do it is that if they get big enough, all those little 1% add up to a big pile of money, but it's not a lot of profit. So this shows different sectors. So for example, like tobacco's over on the right. It's not that the tobacco sector is that much bigger than the food sector. It's not, but its profits are much higher. So you can actually make money selling tobacco. The only thing that makes less money than food is, I guess, advertising, which is interesting, and entertainment, which loses money. You have to pay money to be in the entertainment business. But there's this very, very tight profit margin with food. And it's interesting now, right, because we've had this food inflation and people are very concerned about high food prices. But that's like the difference between 2.2% and 2.8%. Like they made a lot more than they had the year before, but it's still within that very tight margin. It's not like they're suddenly making 40% on food. So that's the economic equation part of it. Like food just doesn't carry much profit because it's so abundant, because it's so efficiently produced, because we have so much of it. All right. So let me just, I'm not going to read much out of the book, but I just want to.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the difference between food, retail, and agriculture? The agriculture is just the farmers, and then the retail is
the stores. Yeah, exactly. And agriculture itself. Yeah, and I'm not sure what they're lumping into agriculture there, and I think that's a very questionable kind of big hopper, because agriculture can be all kinds of different things. So, and I also question whether it's as high as like 7%, because most farmers lose money. So I think there's things to question about that one. The figure of the food retail figure does seem solid based on a lot of different sources. So yeah. Any statistic you can sort of question in that way, yeah. So let me just read just one paragraph that kind of frames the dilemma that I was wrestling with when I first started realizing, like, you can't really make money selling food. So I had no idea how far the supermarket-centered status quo had gotten inside my head, inside everyone's head, until I started helping to run a grocery store. I didn't realize how convenient I expected food shopping to be until I had to help make it convenient for other people or explain why it wasn't as convenient as they were used to. It took time to shift my own thinking about value from simply looking for the best price to trying to spend as much money as I could in the co-op every week, which helped put a little more into our coffers, but didn't change the fact that most people were still looking for the best price. It took a while to come to grips with what that meant for the store's ability to survive. We couldn't charge more for food. People already thought we were too expensive. We couldn't cut costs. They were already slashed to the bone and below. The challenges were economic and emotional, personal and systemic. They felt inexorable, insoluble, and from the outside, it's hard even to understand why. So the book, so I'm an anthropologist, and what we do for research is kind of wade into a situation, kind of hang out there for a while and figure out how the world looks from there. So that's essentially what I did, not because I was being an anthropologist, but just because that was kind of a skill set that I brought to it. But I do feel like it helped me to think of this as, okay, I've got to understand this. It makes no sense to me now, but I can like put these pieces together and come to understand them. I hope so. Let me just sort of pull a couple of strands out of the book. There's like a bunch of braided stories here, and some of them are historical, including a local history piece, and then I'll talk about the co-op itself and kind of how I found a way to more or less resolve that dilemma, like how do you exist within this sort of contradiction. So the local history story that I want to tell is through this little item, so minute tapioca, in a box that has changed almost not at all, right, over many decades. It's a really consistent box. Anybody know what tapioca is made from? Not yucca, but yucca, so very close. So I'll pass this around. So this is a yucca. So,
I'm taking this home.
I can get another one at Market Basket. It's the only reason I go to Market Basket these days is to buy this yucca. So yeah, so yucca is the word we hear more often, but that's the cactus. Exactly. So yucca is this thing, which is, it's a tuber, yeah, and it's waxed, so it's hard to smell it. And I don't think it has much smell anyway. It's it's very starchy. It's a high carb kind of food. It's also called cassava. It's also called manioc. It has all these different names. The one in this West African language means there is life, which tells you it's a staple food for a lot of places and people. Certainly in Indonesia and that part of the world, it's been a staple food for a long time. It's not all that flavorful, but it will keep you alive, and it also will grow anywhere. It's very tough. It will happily stay in the ground for a year or 2 years until you're ready to harvest it. So it's a sort of almost like a food of last resort for some people. But then it also became, around the turn of the 20th century, this kind of trendy tropical food in the United States. So kind of like acai berry or quinoa, things that like nobody had heard of, and then suddenly, ooh, tapioca. And that was the time when there's a lot more sort of mass advertising, and particularly women were like looking for convenient but splashy and impressive desserts that you could, impress your guests with. And so there was a lot of these kinds of new convenience foods coming along. So one of the people who sort of jumped on this bandwagon, this is the origin story for Minute Tapioca, is this woman named Susan Stavers in Boston, who was, and there's a lot of, this is kind of a mythic story, but I did some research and found kind of the story underneath it. She had a boarding house, is the way the myth goes, and there was a sailor who wanted tapioca pudding like he'd had in the Far East, and she made him some pudding and it was too lumpy, and he complained, and so either he told her or she figured out to run it through the coffee grinder, the manual coffee grinder, and it made this lovely smooth pudding. So she said, ooh, voila, and called it tapioca superlative, and she started selling it door to door in little bags. And somehow or other, and this is lost kind of in the murk, but this fellow from Orange named John Whitman, who was a newspaper editor, decided he was going to get into the new convenience food and the packaged food business. I think it was kind of like the dot-com moment, like everybody had a startup, right? Everybody had invented something. So he bought her invention, basically, and started what he called originally the Minute Grocery Company. And he changed the name to Minute Tapioca. He was keying off like the Minuteman figure because, like Minute Tapioca, the Minutemen of 1775 could be ready at a minute's notice, right? So it was this sort of patriotic New England kind of hook, which they dropped fairly soon. But they started doing, kind of recipes and promoting it that way. So it turned out he was much better at running a newspaper than a food business. Largely because he couldn't figure out how to get a consistent supply of cassava. That was a problem at that point. So he very quickly sold out to the newspaper called it local capitalists, people who actually knew something about business, including a fellow who was the bookkeeper for the New Home Sewing Machine Company, which was in Orange. And New Home at that point was, still a brand, but it was like a world leader and a great big company. And he then quickly sort of jumped in and took the helm with his wife, who saw that if you could appeal to women and get the recipes out there and do demonstrations, you could really, kind of do viral marketing, we would say now. And they changed the whole company name to Minute Tapioca. And they didn't invent this formula for success, but it's kind of how these brands, right around the turn of the 20th century, started to become as iconic as they are. And just about like, Quaker Oats and, Maxwell House Coffee and like any brand we can think of as kind of big national brands, they have a really similar origin story. It's like one product and then somebody figured out how to scale them up. But here's the formula. You had to have cheap raw materials. You couldn't be paying a whole lot for whatever you were making stuff from. So that defined cheap tapioca somewhere. They tried sourcing it. They tried buying their own plantation down in Puerto Rico right after Puerto Rico became an American colonial possession. And they bought a 700-acre plantation, which was way too teeny to supply all the cassava they needed to grow into a kind of a national scale brand. And they came to the realization, as one of the leaders said, to be profitable, tapioca must be gotten from yucca grown on cheap land. And what makes land cheap? Partly it's the price of the land, but there's one other thing that makes a place cheap. Right, which is linked basically with poverty, right? Yeah, so you need cheap labor. You need someplace poor, and that is the foundation of a lot of this whole industrial system. Is like to make something in Orange that could actually carry a profit, you had to have super cheap raw materials, and that meant it had to come from somewhere where you weren't paying anybody terribly well. And that's sort of the secret of the dirty secret of the industrial food system. So they did eventually gain a source of supply in Java, in Indonesia, and they sort of helped to expand and create the world market for cassava based out of Indonesia. The second part is that you needed really efficient production, and that usually meant mechanized and very cutting edge. So Orange, like any one of these towns and cities in this part of New England, right, all up and down the river valleys, it's like they had this deep bench of really skilled mechanics and engineers and draftsmen and people who could make and invent things. So they had a real edge in industrializing this product. And so they patented this method, and people in Orange still talk about, if they were school kids while Minute Tapioca was still there, going into the factory, and they had these like giant rumbling drums, and so they would do like a flash steam cooking part of the process, and then they would dry them in these giant rollers, and it left like this indelible memory for people who saw them. So that's another piece. So here's the factory. So it was originally that T shape, and then they added that whole wing on the right, which is concrete, and they sort of expanded. That's where the big giant rumbling drums were to do the sort of really highly mechanized process. And then the third piece of it was mass advertising. And this was also when mass media was really taking hold. So women's magazines, radio, right, all these kind of new media, and just to get the word out there, so that you weren't just trying to sell a little bit of it, you were trying to sell a whole lot of it, and then to sort of make sure that the grocers wanted to have your stuff. So you didn't go selling to them, they came to you looking for it. So this was Minute Tapioca's first full page, full color ad in 1917. And you can see all the pieces of this here in that ad, they were kind of advertising their own operations as well as the product. So the top right is muscle power and draft animals in Java, they're processing the cassava into flour, and then the cooking room. There's the big steam cookers, and then into the little boxes and shipped out on the railroad. So it's like it's the whole thing. It's the whole modern world. It's industry. It's this exotic sort of 12,000 miles away location. It's the cheap invisible labor that makes it possible to sell something cheaply, even though it has to travel 12,000 miles. And this was more than 100 years ago, right? So we think of often the food system that we have now as quite new. It wants us to think that. Supermarkets want you to think how shiny and new everything is. But this actually is pretty deep-rooted now. It really is more than 100 years since people figured out how to do that. And as I say, the people in orange were not the first or the only ones figuring this out. This guy was one of the main kind of the people who figured it out sort of first and best and really kind of capitalized on it. So C.W. Post started the Postum cereal companies. Anybody know what Postum still is around? But what it?
Post now, like Post Raisin Bran?
Post, sorry, say again?
Like the Raisin Bran?
So that's the cereals, and actually Grape Nuts was his first cereal, but Post cereal is exactly that. It was Post, but Postum was. It's a drink. Yeah. Do you know what? Yeah. It's a grain-based rather than chicory, but it's a coffee substitute. And he invented it as a kind of a health food while he was doing a sort of a health cure because he was avoiding caffeine. And there were actually a slew of these things also on the market. So that was his first product, and he had this whole sort of factory complex there. But that was just sort of individual products. And the next generation was his daughter, Marjorie Merriweather Post, who was the richest woman in America at one time. She built a nice little place called Mar-a-Lago. That's who built Mar-a-Lago. And she and her second of many husbands went on this buying spree in the 1920s because they could see that you had to keep growing and getting bigger because the competition is so fierce. And you could only grow so many brands so much. So the next way that you grow, you start combining the brands. You build yourself a whole family of brands. And so they started buying up other companies. So they bought Jell-O first, Swansdown. Minute Tapioca was very early on. It was just after Minute Tapioca had sort of perfected this nice method of making tapioca pudding. And they sort of went on until they bought Clarence Birdseye's General Seafood Companies. Anybody know what his innovation was? Flash freezing, yeah, exactly, which lets you do a whole other layer of, transportation and storage and different kinds of products. So then they changed the name from Post Company or Postum to General Foods. That's when General Foods came along. And at that point, the people in orange were like over the moon. They thought this was great. Here's this great big national company. We're golden. Like we're going to be here forever and ever. And they were there for quite a long time. There's like 60 some years with this factory, and there's like hundreds of people that worked there. But after World War II, it was like Minute Tapioca just had kind of lost its competitive edge. It wasn't a new product. They hadn't really changed it in a long time. There were other things that were faster and cooler, and a lot of this is driven by what's new and cool. So they left. The company moved the production of Minute Tapioca to Delaware. And there's still kind of hard feelings about that. And I love the editorial. It's like, no true New Englander will like Delaware. Like, fine. But then this last paragraph, surely there must be enough good old Yankee ingenuity in orange people so they can map their own destiny rather than be dragged along with the crowd to a part of the country which is foreign to them, like Delaware, right? But there's that, that sense of bitterness or sadness of like that we've lost control, like we don't control our own, our own industries and our own food supply, and that's that sense of being disconnected and, having the control go somewhere else. And then that's not the end of the General Foods story because, so you had like these companies buying up other companies, but then other companies started buying up those big companies, right? And this is the story of what's happened in the food sector. It's tremendously consolidated, as many many industries are at this point. But in the 1980s, Philip Morris, which had been what kind of company? Tobacco, was suddenly buying up food companies. Why might it have been doing that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep, exactly. So, you know, they were rebranding, they were trying to diversify. So they bought General Foods, which was a giant company in itself. And then they bought Kraft, which was another giant company. And then they bought Nabisco, which was another giant company. And they lumped them all together under the Kraft name for a while. And then that merged with Heinz, which was another consortium of, you know, of brands, which at that point was owned by Berkshire Hathaway, which is a financial company. It's a, you know, it's capital, it's pure capital, and 3G Capital. These are not food companies anymore, right? These are, and this is that, you know, once you get to a certain scale, it's just stock market, you know, that's all it is. And it's purely playing with money, which is why I think people get so upset when that then affects like food prices or food availability. It's like, this is our food you're messing with, right? And there's that sense that there's just something wrong with that. And yet that's where we are with the big companies. So it's now all something called Kraft Heinz, all of that stuff. But Kraft Heinz is just one thing here, right? So this is, you know, this whole pie made up of similar giant companies that have gobbled up similar smaller companies. So you know, each one of those brands has got a story like Minute Tapiocas and a town or a city somewhere that, you know, used to have, you know, that factory. And then back of that, you know, these supply chains of invisible people and undervalued, you know, cheap land, all that cheap land. And then just to give you a sense of how big this is. So Unilever, which is the top there, which is a Dutch company. They bought Ben & Jerry's famously a while back, which was kind of weird because Ben & Jerry's is this very, you know, progressive, radical, Vermont-based thing, and here it was being bought by this giant conglomerate. Well, now they're spinning off all their ice cream because ice cream profits only rose 3.5%, 3.2% last year. Only rose. They went up, but they didn't go up as much as they wanted them to. And that 3.2% amounts to $8.6 billion. That's just ice cream in just one of those slices of the pie, right? So that is how big this stuff has gotten. And it's, as I say, it's not just food, but it's particularly in food, the consolidation has been really, really big. So, you know, a few supermarkets tend to dominate most markets. New England is actually more diversified than most places. It's interesting. So we have Market Basket. We have, well, Stop and Shop is now closing a bunch of stores, right? So it's, you know, the shakeouts still go on. But people have talked about this as the hourglass model, that there's like a lot of eaters on the one hand and a lot of sellers and producers on the other hand, but in the middle there's this sort of, you know, the bottleneck of, and that's where the profits are mostly extracted. So when we talk about food inflation and profiteering, so that's where that's happening because they can, you know, they can sort of slice off more of those little thin slices at that point. And there's ways to survive. So Postum, which was that grain-based drink, Kraft Heinz decided they didn't want it anymore. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't enough of a market for them. But there's still faith communities that really like it because they avoid caffeine. So the Seventh-day Adventists really always liked it. They were a big fan base of Postum. So these Seventh-day Adventists in North Carolina bought the secret formula, and they're manufacturing it again. Right? So that's one way to try to make money. The way that most of the companies do it is they just keep buying each other. Right? They're just continuing to get bigger and bigger, or sell something else, sell Prime memberships, or, you know, pharmaceuticals, or something else. The question is, if you're trying to have some kind of alternative to this, you know, what can that be? And so there are food co-ops. Anybody ever belonged to a food co-op? Yeah, which one?
And every community I lived in, I
Yay.
belonged to one. So
Great.
I started in Austin.
Oh.
Carver, North Carolina.
Great.
And then Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
And then I helped start one in
Great.
Iowa.
Fabulous.
And now I belong to the Cedar Valley one.
Great. That's great. So that's a model of people trying to retain more control and not go that corporate route. We're trying to do that in Orange, which is it's one of the poorer places in Massachusetts. Looking at so the darker places are the higher income. And, this tracks pretty much with deindustrialized, former mill towns trying to come back from losing their industrial bases very, very often. And we're also more rural than a place like East Longmeadow, where the population density just isn't there. So it's kind of crazy that there's a food co-op there, but there is. And it started in 2009. And this is one of the reasons I sort of drew the Minute Tapioca story in. We actually started in the old Minute Tapioca factory, which is now it's called the Orange Innovation Center, and it's kind of an incubator space, and there's a craft brewery, and there's like massage therapy, and there's, all the things that you find in an incubator space. So the store started, actually it wasn't a store at first, it was a seasonal buying club. It's mostly a bunch of young mothers who wanted to access fresh fruits and vegetables from local farms, but they wanted to be able to aggregate them in one place. So they had this buying club, and then they started a tiny little store with just a few more things beyond just the vegetables year-round in the OIC. And then they needed more space because they needed a bigger freezer or a cooler because the one they had kept breaking down and nobody could find them in there. So in 2014, they partnered with a local land trust called Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, which covers 23 towns up in that part of Mass, which conserves farmland. So they were interested in helping, kind of farmers, but they had a very far-seeing leadership that said, well, why should we stop with just protecting farmland? Like, can't we do something to help build a market, like a node for actually selling farm products? So they bought this old bank to serve as a storefront for the co-op, and they're still our landlord and are very good friends because we don't always pay them the rent that we ought to. And they recognize that. That's Orange, yep, exactly. Yep, it's in Orange, yep. So it was a workers' credit union branch there that moved out to build a flashy new branch. And the land trust is, they've come to see this as it's a program. It's like an investment that they're making in, kind of community resilience, and which has been great for us. So, but as I say, we've been in the red ever since we opened that store. We've learned a lot. We're still learning, and we're still there. And we do have a lot of good friends. We have realized a lot of things. So one of them is that we need to diversify beyond just sort of selling food in the store, because we cannot charge enough to keep the store going, like not in a market area like Orange, where people just are not going to, many can't, and a lot of them just won't pay more than you could get at a supermarket. So we started a prepared foods division, which is one of the ways that you can make money on food, actually, is to kind of add the value by doing prepared foods. We do source from a lot of local farmers, including these three here, who grow a lot of the food for what we call our community shares program. So we do a lot of distributions of it's subsidized somehow, like partnering with foundations or with the state on grants and things, so that people who are low income can actually access this good, healthy food from local farms. So the bags there on the top left are from our summer farm share program. So for 10 weeks every summer, low-income seniors get a bag like that every week. There's 70 households this summer that are getting those. So all grown by the farmers here who are at an educational nonprofit farm. See, that's the way to make money selling food. Don't try to make money, just be a nonprofit. And it's funny because our store is like, we kind of act like a nonprofit, but we are a for-profit business. We just don't turn a profit. So that's kind of, what I was trying to navigate in the book is how do you talk about that with people? How do you explain we're not just an incompetent, failing little store. We're a struggling little store, but here's why. Here's what we're struggling with and struggling against. And to try to use that, as I've tried to use the book, to kind of open up some of these questions so that it gets beyond just you're a business, you should be able to stand on your own 2 feet. It would be wonderful. I'm not averse to that, but I think I've come to see that to do that, to pay the farmers fairly, to try to pay our workers fairly, to sort of do all of that, we have to look beyond what we can charge for the food that we're selling. We just have to. And one of the things that and this kind of gets back to my own kind of background and kind of social class, and being kind of embarrassed by that at first, or at least, kind of frustrated, and it's like, why can't we just be normal? It was just really hard to kind of do the normal thing, and then to come to kind of embrace that, like, this is not normal. It is adventurous. It's really trying to push against a very entrenched mainstream, and when you do that, you get in trouble. It's kind of it's perceived as being like odd. Why are you doing that? Why? Yeah.
The difference between normal and normalized.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, this should be normal, right? It's like it should be rational, and people should be able to charge a rational price for food. But what's normalized is the cheap food, the long distance change, the gigantic size that we don't see because it's hidden under all these brands. So thank you for that distinction. Yeah.
And then what are the other grocery store chains
nearby? Yeah, so we have, so there's a Walmart just down the road in Orange with a supermarket in it. There's a Hannaford, big Hannaford, a couple miles beyond that, kind of on the town line between Orange and Athol, which is the two main towns. And then on the other side of Athol, there's a Market Basket, which has a cult following, as many Market Baskets do. Like, people love Market Basket because it feels like that kind of mom and pop, regional, like the kind of old style grocery, and yet it can offer the convenience and the prices of the big supermarkets. So it kind of ticks all the boxes there. So yeah, so we have 3 great big supermarkets, and then we have just to the west, the Connecticut Valley and a number of much bigger co-ops. So Brattleboro, Greenfield, Northampton. People sometimes shop there, and then we have Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, and people will often go down to Hadley to shop there. So yeah, so there's a lot of competition, even though we're in the middle of kind of nothing in the center of Orange. There's almost nothing else in the center of Orange. And that's the other struggle, is it's a fairly empty downtown. So nobody goes there to shop. So I'll just finish with talking about this kind of, one of the things that really helped me to navigate that, kind of that tension or that frustration, is this woman who started our prepared foods division named Nalini. And her story really helped me think about this bigger context of kind of how the food system has developed and how the whole kind of modern world has developed. So she is Indo-Guyanese. So she grew up in what was then British Guyana, and it's now just Guyana. They became independent from Britain in the 70s, I think. But her family is Indo, she's from, they're from India, from Uttar Pradesh, which is the poorest, most rural state in India. A lot of poor people, a lot of poor farmers, a lot of farmers not able to make a living. So her great-grandparents were among the many, many indentured Indian servants who were workers who were brought to, the Brits were doing this all over the world, and through the Caribbean, to work in the sugarcane plantations after slavery was abolished. Right? So, and it was, Nalini says it was a little better than slavery. We weren't owned outright, but it wasn't much better, and certainly the conditions weren't that much better. So her great-grandparents came, grandparents, and then her parents, her father particularly, sort of said, there's no future here. And he was this sort of progressive-looking man. He said, I've got these daughters, and I want them to get an education. That's not going to happen here. So they managed to find their way to New York. And she actually went to college and got a degree in computers and worked in the tech sector for quite a while, and decided that corporate life she'd had enough of that, and kind of retired with her partner to Orange and bought a very cheap house, which you can do in Orange, and volunteered at the co-op, and then we quickly kind of hired her. And then when we, thinking about a prepared foods division, we said, would you start that? And she did. She's an amazing cook, and she can cook all kinds of different things. But she also is someone who, she recognizes the kind of the harms of the basically colonial, economy, and how that has affected people who are at the low end of it and don't have, much power within it, and how that sort of shaped relationships to food and to land and to each other, and and so she has worked really hard in her own life to sort of heal that and to have a healthier relationship with how she eats and with food, and she sees it as a real gift. She's a wonderful, generous person with food, and not just like eat, but to with really caring about food. So talking with her and working with her and kind of thinking about her story really let me, as I say, kind of resolve that tension. So I'm just going to read one more little piece about this. So her family has a maxim that says you should always at all times have both hands open, one to take and one to give. So that gets referenced here. So even though nothing could be more authentic than eating jerk yam and black beans made by someone who learned at her Indo-Guyanese grandmother's knee, authenticity wasn't the point. The point was the food was incredibly good, and Nalini loved cooking it for us as much as we loved eating it. She also loved the way it enabled the co-op to put something out into the world that then made the world want to give something back to the co-op. What came back to us was in the form of money, but the money alone wasn't the point. The point was the exchange, the reciprocity. At last we were able to have both hands open, one to give and one to receive. Generosity, in fact, was the point. Generosity as principle, generosity as strategy for moving towards something that was after the plantation, outside the commodity and the corporation, while still existing within the world that their cheapness and bigness had made ubiquitous and unavoidable. Generosity was the right response to the insoluble puzzle that was the modern food system. So that's kind of how I came through and out the other side, and didn't, we haven't solved it yet. We're not profitable yet, but most of us have learned to navigate this. And to me, that was kind of the lesson of how to be on the margins and to have a certain kind of toughness, but also a certain joy in doing this, rather than just feeling beaten down because yet again we couldn't pay all the bills this week. It's really easy to get kind of crushed by that, and the lesson was really kind of learning how not to be crushed and how to be really proud of being engaged in doing this kind of work. So I'll stop there so that we have a bit of time to talk. If people have thoughts or questions, or yeah.
What's the economics in Orange? I mean, the main factory is gone, so I mean, you're picking up small businesses.
Yeah. There are a couple of industrial parks. We actually do have some small scale stuff. Nothing really big, but some smaller businesses. Yeah. There's a courthouse. There's some like public kind of sector stuff. There's not a great deal. There's a lot of empty space at this point. There's Pete's Tire Barns is a good-sized business, and kind of a statewide business. But Orange is the fourth poorest town in the state. So it's in terms of per capita income.
So where are you drawing your people from? I mean, since Orange probably couldn't support you.
Exactly. Yeah. Good question. So. Some from Orange, some from Athol, which is the biggest town of the 9 North Quabbin towns, but quite a lot from, then there's like 7 other towns that this gets lumped together and called the North Quabbin region. So the 2 main mill towns and then these 7 hill towns, basically. And we have a lot of members from the hill towns. That's where all the old hippies are, like me, are living, right? The people who know from food co-ops. So we have quite a member base in like Wendell, Warwick, Petersham, New Salem, those towns. Yeah, so it's sort of spread probably between people in the little towns and then those two main ones. Okay, yeah, and I would say it's interesting. I think that a lot of the people who work in Orange don't live there, and a lot of people who live in Orange don't work there. Like I work at Tufts. I work in Boston. And that's very common. It's like those of us who have the means to shop and support the co-op have a job somewhere else. Yeah. So, and that's common in a lot of rural places. Right?
Food deserts.
Yeah.
Capitalism, I mean, it's a byproduct of the appetite for profit.
Yeah.
And so they make these ambivalent decisions to close down. The food giants make these ambivalent decisions to close down grocers.
Yep.
And so there's a conflict between the capitalist's appetite for profit and the public policy dictates that's safe.
That's right.
So what does your research tell you about the future of food deserts? Is it hopeful or dire?
So let me, there's so much to say about food deserts, including the term itself, which it's interesting. People in the, like the food access, food assistance world are starting to move away from that term because people who live in so-called food deserts, which Orange is actually one of them, will sort of say, it sounds dead, right? It sounds like there's no life here, and which is not always the case. It's just there's no supermarket here because you're right, because it doesn't make money. So that's one thing. One of the weird things about getting into the grocery business, I wouldn't say I have sympathy for Walmart and Kroger at this point, but I understand those decisions because these are not charities, These are for-profit corporations. And so Walmart got lured into, enticed and convinced into Chicago a couple of years ago with like 7 big new stores, including some in the South Side, which is the historically black neighborhood and one of the poorer parts of the town, or city. And they're losing money hand over fist in most of those locations, and they just closed 4 of them, including the ones in the South Side. And it's terrible, but you can see it from Walmart's perspective, right? Like they are not a charity. And that's where, like, when you get to a certain scale, you can't really reconcile the demands for profit with the need to feed everybody fairly, right? Those things really become incompatible. So I do feel hopeful because I think morally people just know that that's so messed up, right? And there's people who can't access decent food or sometimes food at all. And you look around and co-ops have been a really interesting player in some of this. So for example, Burlington, Vermont had a Price Chopper, and I keep meaning to look up whether Price Chopper just died or they've just pulled back, but there's not as many Price Choppers as there were. So the Price Chopper in the center, the one that was in the center of the city, closed in Burlington. And the city partnered with the Onion River Co-op. It's been there for a long time, and the food bank in the area. So a nonprofit, the cooperative for-profit grocery store, and the city, which taps into a whole lot of interesting funding sources and kinds of support. And they said to the co-op, look, if you reopen this supermarket and do it at price points that people can afford, because there's a lot of people in Burlington that don't have a lot of money, we'll be your partner. So the city is a player in that. And that's a really interesting model. They're looking at it in Chicago for exactly the same reason. Nonprofits and cities don't always run a grocery store all that well. It's hard to run a grocery store. But I think the model is kind of emerging. And it feels to me like people are getting to a point of just saying, like, this is just not fair. It's just not fair. And when you look at where these so-called food deserts are, it's poverty. It's not about a desert. It's about impoverishment in various ways. Yeah.
Where does food waste fit into all that?
Oh my God.
We throw away so much food.
I know.
And I taught high school for 20 years. But we throw away so much food in school. Yeah. It's unbelievable. And a lot of it's processed crap. That we eat anyways. Yep. But that's their only option. Yeah. They're either going to eat it or they're going to throw it away.
Yeah.
It's unfathomable to me how much food we throw away.
It is. And again, there's like this moral revulsion about, especially when you pair it with the fact that there are people that can't get enough food, right? Those two things like blow people's minds, as they should, right? But yeah, so I actually talk about that a fair bit, not a fair bit, but there's a chunk of the stuff where I talk about the overabundance of the food system, because you were talking about how astonishingly abundant it is. It actually produces far more food than we need to feed everybody. And that's not just the US. We sort of think, oh, it must be just rich countries, but in the world, we actually produce, as humans, more than enough calories to feed 10 billion people, which is what you always hear, oh, we have to double food production because there's going to be 10 billion people. It's like, we could feed 10 billion people if they were actually good, nutritious calories, and if it was distributed equitably, which it's not, right? So it's distribution, and that's the problems of poverty and redlining and policy and all of those things. So the food waste, which is another whole book, I think, it's endemic. It is part of this system because it would be so much more expensive. Food would get much more expensive if we tried to fine-tune supply and demand. It's like wildly out of whack now, but it's just easier to do that because it's produced cheaply, right?
A whole lot of it,
that's right.
Half of it goes to waste. We don't
Yeah,
care.
and what you hear is 30 to 40% of the food that's produced for humans doesn't get it. It's unconscionable. Yeah, especially when there are people who are you know, who would need food. They don't necessarily need that food, because you're right, it may not be the food they want, it may not be very good food, but sometimes it is. I mean, a lot of the produce, because the wholesaler has a truck full of stuff that is, you know, it's not going to still be good by the time he gets to the market. He's not going to drive it there anyway and then throw it out. He's going to throw it out, you know, when as soon as he can, and get back and get something that is going to sell. So that's, again, is that you know, when you tie it so closely to profit, these decisions get made that make no sense to most of us, and that's where I get frustrated. So my students are always coming up with these solutions, like we should just get the good food to the people. It's like, it sounds so easy, right? But you need, and we have this whole sort of shadow food system of the food banking system and the pantries and, you know, the USDA and food assistance and SNAP and all of that. Like, we have an entire kind of industrial shadow side of the food system to try to do that, and even so, even with that, all that food goes to waste. So, because it doesn't, no one will pay as much as it would take to actually, you know, scale it down to the point that, isn't that weird? Scaling it down would be much more expensive. It's only cheap because it's so big. And it only works in its current form when it's this big. And that, you know, $8.6 billion on just ice cream, with just the 3% increase in ice cream in one company. So, and when a company is looking at decisions, you know, on that scale, they're not thinking about how much is getting thrown out in a high school cafeteria, or, you know, whatever. They're really just looking at the balance sheet and saying, oh, this makes no sense. We'll just let that go.
Yeah. Well, and locally, at least East Long Meadow schools, in the last 2 years, have started composting, which is awesome.
Fabulous.
Right? And
yeah.
so, like, that, I feel like, has helped, and I think it has educated students to a large extent of, like, just noticing how much food they throw away and being able to prevent that amount of food, at least from going into the landfill, at least, is being composted and kind of reused in the community. But I feel like that's just, it's just a drop in the bucket.
It is, but it's also, that's a very widespread thing, and I don't want to say like the next generation will fix everything, but I think the next generation, and, you know, the students that I see at Tufts, they get it much more. Like, they're much more attuned to those questions than I was growing up. And I write about, the book starts out talking about, like, me as a little kid, I grew up in suburban Ontario, going to the supermarket in this early 60s. So, you know, I'm in my 60s now, and it's like, that was, the supermarket was just becoming this normal thing. It was cool. It was kind of cool to go there, right? And I'm guessing, you know, that some of us in this room kind of remember that, you know, kind of the supermarket just becoming this thing that was like air. We didn't question it. It's just kind of there. And I feel like it's complicated, because my students also love Trader Joe's, and they love Amazon Prime, and you know, they're not questioning everything about it. But I think they're more attuned to the ecological implications of this, and also the social justice ones, you know, the equity of who gets good food. So, so I'm hopeful on that count as well. I'm hopeful in a lot of reasons. I just think more of us need to be a little more, you know, kind of aware of what we're up against, I guess, is what I'm thinking. Like, not to be sort of, to be thinking, just because this is wrong, we can just fix it. It's like, we need to, I think, understand the underpinnings of this, you know, this whole crazy system that we've got. Crazy, but also amazing. You know, it really does feed a lot of people really well. So, and we shouldn't wish for it to fail, because we'd all just die really quickly, really, truly. I mean, we are so dependent on it at this point. So that's the idea of making something within it while it's still there, which I think co-ops are a really hopeful model for. Yeah.
I just feel like there's so many tiny little groups and businesses that are trying to make a difference, and I just wish there was a way to let them kind of come together and
there are some. There are some, and I think New England is really a good place to be for that. So there's a whole project now called New England Feeding New England. And it came out of, so you're familiar with that? Yeah, it came out of earlier planning and visioning. There's something called the New England Food Vision that just sort of said, you know, okay, we're importing 90% of our food. What would it look like? What would it take if we grew 50% of our food? Not 100, but 50. Could we do it? And it ran some numbers and some projections, which was super helpful to envision this. So now that's really gone region-wide. And this New England Feeding New England is the big state food policy councils and big planning groups. I mean, it's very wonky. It's kind of within government, but it also connects to a lot of sort of you know, civil society projects and little businesses. And it's under the radar. It's kind of boring. A lot of that work is, you know, it's very wonky, it's very policy oriented, but it is happening, and there's some really smart people doing it. So I feel like it's out there if you kind of go looking for it sometimes. Yeah. Yeah, check that one out, because they have some really good reports. That was why the first part was boring. It was just data gathering, but it was, but there are some reports there that give a sense of kind of what's in progress already. So, yeah.
Do you think that most co-ops that are around have your same model and your same profit?
Most of them are much more profitable, not all of them, but most of them are. And it's pretty much the same model. I mean, I think most co-ops, and it's a lot of the same inventory, because we tend to buy from the same suppliers and, you know, the same kinds of things. So there are some really successful co-ops, the ones that have managed to get big so they actually can compete. So River Valley up in Northampton, the Hanover Food Co-op in Hanover, New Hampshire is like, that out Whole Foods is Whole Foods. It's just amazing. You know, giant co-op, very successful with kind of multiple branches. So
I feel like every co-op that I belonged to that was successful was in a university town.
Thank you. So, yep.
So you have the higher level of education, you have the higher level of income, and so they can afford to exist in that community.
Yep.
But in a community like Orange, like, you don't have that.
That's right, and so it's why I'm using Orange as kind of a test case. To me, it's like, okay, if because you're right, it's like, it's almost sort of artificial. It's not artificial support, but it takes a particular affluent kind of a neighborhood.
That's where Trader Joe's goes.
Yes.
That's right, and they are.
Trader Joe's goes into the communities where there's a higher level of education.
But not income, and that's the interesting thing with the TJ's model was he went specifically for people with lots of sort of cultural and educational capital, but not necessarily high income. Right. And then there were these quirky things that let you find, you know, like you were a sense of discovery, and you know, it's kind of fun and weird to shop, and that hit that demographic. And my students just can't get enough of it. They just love it. He was very successful.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's how they place their store.
That's right. That's right, yeah.
What's it like for the community of Orange to live through an era of subtraction and then to have a co-op come to town and say, you have agency? Instead of being victims, we're an emblem for strength of community and self-direction and agency. There's hope here, and it's more than just food, it's presence.
Yeah, I would say that the people who see themselves as victims are not the same people who are seeing themselves as having agency. And it's like, and there's a class divide sort of implicit there. And you know, Orange and the area, like a lot of industrial towns, has a sort of working class sensibility, and the people around co-op tend to be the people who lived in a college town at one point, most of us. So, so I think there's a divide there. It's getting less so over time, but that's more kind of our relationship building and just talking to a lot of people and hanging on, right? Hanging on. And I think, so we actually, I'll give away the ending of the book here, which was we almost went bankrupt again 2 weeks before COVID started. And like literally, bankruptcy was on the table. We had an emergency meeting. We thought, is this it? And the members just showed up in droves, and they just said, no, we're not going to quit. And there was a really interesting feeling in that moment, because it was like a fairly wide swath of the community. And it was that sort of working class grid. It was like, nope, damn it, we're going to dig in, we're going to figure this out, we're going to do it for ourselves. So there was a feeling, I think, of that gathering around the co-op and to save the co-op, which we did. We did an emergency fundraising campaign. The store had been nearly empty because we were so out of money. So we restocked the store, and then the pandemic started, and everybody rushed in and was so happy to see all the stuff that we bought. So I feel like there has been a shift. There's still a sense of kind of division, and everybody kind of knows that, you know, I describe this as a blue island and a red island in a blue state, kind of, you know, in terms of people's politics around things in general. But there's also a sense of, yeah, it's sort of embedded here and belongs here. So that's what we're working on. Yeah. So we should probably wrap up, right, Maura? So yeah. Yeah. I do have books for sale if you want to buy one. I have an event price of $20. There's an audio book that's supposed to come out in a week and a bit, which was the hardest I've worked in a long time. Recording audio is much harder than writing a book. So, but I also have stickers and postcards if you want to take one and order one later. But thank you so much, and thanks for this good discussion. Yeah, thanks.